Now, let's recap. So we've already talked about frequency of stimulation leading to the stimulus. So the higher the frequency, the hertz, the stronger the contraction, or the larger the force generated by the muscle fibers. But let's not forget the number of muscle fibers in the first place. And this should bring us back to this idea of the motor units. Not only how many motor units are being activated, but how big the motor units are in the first place. If we're looking at hands, for example, and let's assume we have 25 fibers, muscle fibers, single cells, to one neuron. So that's my size of my motor unit. As you can imagine, this will generate less force than a motor unit that we might find in the quadriceps, where we have 1,000 fibers per neuron. So here we've just got the size of the motor units are different. Now imagine the number of motor units. Okay, so that leads back to this number of fibers. So obviously, if I'm going to activate, let's say I'm going to activate 4 motor units in my hands, well, the amount of force that I generate will be much larger than if I only activate 1, but it won't be even close to comparison to 4 motor units in the quads. And all of this really comes down to the number of fibers. You can see that the number of fibers would be much greater the larger the motor unit is and the more motor units that are being activated. If we go back up here then and we kind of look at this, let me erase some of the mess that I created here. Okay, not very good at erasing. What ends up happening, if we were to compare the difference, let's just pretend that this is 1 motor unit here. If we compare that to a twitch created in a motor unit, let's say a situation where we have a strong enough voltage to activate 2 motor units, then not surprisingly our twitch is larger. All right, that looks more than 2, but we'll pretend 2 motor units. And you will have seen that in lab, in your muscle lab situation. As you increase the stimulus, the amplitude, as you increase the amp, what ends up happening is first off, the bare minimum, you've reached threshold, and you maybe activate a couple of motor units. If you increase the amplitude beyond that, you're activating more motor units. So the amplitude equals more motor units in your lab being activated. And so that's why if you compare, let's say, well, like for most of us, 1 amp was below threshold and we didn't even get a muscle twitch. But maybe if we went up to 5 amps, then we start seeing a muscle twitch. If we were to increase that to 10 amps, the size of the twitch would be much larger because we're involving more muscle fibers. Now, the thickness of each muscle fiber, essentially, if we were to kind of sketch this out, so here's my actin fibers. And we'll pretend that this is a thick muscle. So let me add in a few more actin fibers here. And naturally we're going to have some myosin fibers. Sorry, this is getting kind of ugly, but it's the idea that counts, right? Okay, so this would be a thick sarcomer or muscle versus a thin The simple fact that I have more actin and myosin in a sarcomer means I can make more cross bridges. Simply based on size, available space. And so the more cross bridges I make, the stronger my contraction will be. The last part of muscle strength has to do with this interesting relationship between length and force. This one's a little tricky to understand, but it's important to understand because it actually is very relevant in the cardiac muscle as well. So if we compare here our muscle fiber lengths at rest, so we're going to say this is at rest before we begin to contract. And we're going to call this one here normal, or actually we'll call it optimal. Okay. Let's say we have really tight muscles. Okay. Well, in that case, our sarcomer at rest is already in a contracted state. And you'll note that there's no overlap, which means when the myosin begins to pull and contract, it really can't do anything else. It can't shorten this much at all, if at all. Okay, so the amount of force that is going to generate it is very little. If you look at the graph, you'll see that in this example, 165, it's right here. Our ability to generate tension, not great if our muscles are tight. But let's say we stretch out, we warm up our muscles. We're ready to go on a run, whatever we're doing, we warm up our muscles first. Well, the act of warming up and stretching increases the length of the muscle. And now if we look at the difference, let's look at the difference between distance, right? This one's shorter. And when we contract those muscle fibers, even if we shorten it all the way, which it actually can't get too much shorter than what it's showing here, we don't have enough room to generate force. We're going to run out of force. Okay. The spring is already sprung, so to speak. The ability to generate that force is greatly diminished. But here, if you look at the distance we can cross, well, we now have a much greater distance that we can generate force in. And so as we look at this fiber, you'll note that this is an optimal length. We've stretched out, we've warmed up the muscle, it's an optimal length, and it's going to generate more force than we would get with tight muscles. This is a great thing, generate strength. Now, too much of a good thing can actually cause harm. If we stretch so far that we lose the overlap between actin and myosin, there's nothing for the myosin heads to grab onto. And in this case, if we can't grab that actin, we cannot generate force. And so you'll see right here. Now, I mentioned it has relevance to the cardiac system, and I will revisit this idea in the cardiac system, but basically, one of the causes of congestive heart failure has to do with the muscle length. As the ventricle of the heart stretches out due to high blood pressure or whatever the cause, it loses its ability to generate force. And so if we look at that, less force means less movement of blood, and as the problem progresses, less and less movement until eventually it kills us.